The corridors of the royal palace in Madrid are silent, save for the shuffle of hurried footsteps echoing against marble. It is the summer of 1834, and the city lies suffocating under a wave of cholera. But inside the palace, a different kind of dread coils in the air. Ferdinand, the seventh King of Spain, lies dead. And yet your work as royal physician is not finished. In fact, it has just begun. You have been summoned to the private chambers of the late king. When you arrive, you find not just grief but something close to desperation written on the faces of those who wait. Queen Regent Maria Cristina stands rigid near the bed, her eyes raw from weeping, her voice unsteady, as she issues a command that chills you to the bone. You are to preserve him, every part of him, not only the king's body but the most grotesque and infamous part of his anatomy. Your hands tremble as you approach. Even in death, Ferdinand seems to mock his kingdom. His waxen face, swollen from illness, still carries that expression of disdain that courtiers had feared for decades. But it is not his face that holds your attention. It is the secret beneath the silk sheets. The deformity that had defined him as much as his paranoia, his betrayals, his cruelty. Ferdinand's body concealed an anatomical monstrosity, so bizarre that whispers about it travelled from palace corridors into the darker corners of Madrid taverns, even into reports sent abroad by foreign ambassadors. It was said that his sexual organ was enormous, but not merely large. It was deformed, grotesquely shaped, more a weapon of torment than a symbol of virility. To preserve it, you realize, is to preserve not just flesh, but a symbol of an entire reign. His reign, like his body, had been swollen, misshapen, and ultimately destructive. As you prepare the instruments and cloths, your thoughts wander. You recall the stories whispered behind fans at court, the ones no official chronicle dared to write. Stories of wedding nights that ended in screams of royal cushions, specially constructed to withstand his deformity, of wives, dosed with laudanum, to survive the bedchamber. You remember how courtiers avoided his gaze, not only out of respect but because they knew that mockery, even whispered, might cost them their lives. This moment is not just grotesque, it is historic. For here lies the proof that the deformity of a single man seeped into the very arteries of Spain. Ferdinand had been both monster and victim, made cruel by the weight of his own shame, made tyrant by a crown he could never wear with dignity. His anatomy was the secret mirror of his kingdom. Unnatural, distorted, incapable of true union, always breaking what it touched. Maria Cristina's request makes sense in its terrible way. To her, the preservation of the king's most infamous attribute is a duty, a ritual that ties body to power, secrecy to survival. If word of the true scale of Ferdinand's condition escaped uncontrolled, it could destabilize the fragile claim of his young daughter Isabella to the throne. The monarchy's survival depends on silence, and so you must act. Yet as you look down at Ferdinand, you cannot help but feel a deeper irony. For centuries, Spain had been bound by dynastic marriages between cousins and uncles and nieces, driven by politics rather than nature. The result was not just weak kings but warped bodies, unstable minds, and in Ferdinand's case, a deformity that would ripple through history like a curse. You are not just preserving a corpse tonight, you are preserving the physical embodiment of Spain's decline. The air in the chamber is heavy with incense, meant to mask the stench of death. The tapestries depicting triumphs of Spanish arms seem almost mocking, as though the empire itself is watching in silence, while its ruler lies exposed in humiliation. A handful of courtiers stand in the shadows too, afraid to look closely, too bound by loyalty to turn away. They know that the preservation is not for medicine nor even for posterity. It is to protect the monarchy from ridicule. Your hands move automatically, trained by years of practice, but your mind is haunted. The more you work, the more you sense the tragedy of it all. That Spain, once master of oceans and empires, has been reduced to this, a secret embalming of a grotesque royal organ, as though the fate of the nation itself were wrapped in linen and hidden away in darkness. As you tie the final knot in the cloth, you wonder, is this preservation an act of duty, or is it a curse? For the truth of Ferdinand's body will outlive him, whispering through archives and rumors, a grotesque inheritance passed not to his daughter alone but to Spain itself. And so begins the story of Ferdinand VII, a king whose personal deformities shaped not only the lives of his wives and courtiers, but the fate of an entire nation. A man who carried in his body the monstrous legacy of centuries of inbreeding, and whose reign, like his anatomy, left scars that could never heal. To understand the strange destiny of Ferdinand VII, you must first look backward into the lineage that produced him. He was not cursed by sorcery nor punished by divine wrath. His curse came from something far more insidious and far more deliberate: the cold arithmetic of dynastic politics. For centuries, Spain's royal houses, the Habsburgs before and the Bourbons after, had clung to power through marriages that were less about love than about sealing borders, cementing alliances, and keeping blood pure. But purity is a dangerous illusion. In practice, it meant cousins marrying cousins, uncles wedding nieces, and generation after generation of tangled family trees. The Habsburgs had already demonstrated the consequences. Charles II, El Hechizado, the bewitched, born so deformed and feeble that he could barely chew his food or speak properly, yet crowned King of Spain. His infertility ended the Habsburg line. The Bourbons, brought from France to replace them, continued many of the same practices. Ferdinand was born into this poisoned inheritance on the 14th of October 1784 at El Escorial Palace, a sprawling granite monastery palace that itself felt like a monument to both grandeur and decay. He was the son of King Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma. Even this marriage had been arranged between first cousins, as if the lessons of the past had been willfully ignored. From the moment Ferdinand entered the world, the dice were loaded against him. Physically, he seemed robust enough in infancy, but court physicians and attendants whispered quietly about oddities, about a child who cried with unusual intensity, whose proportions seemed slightly off. In an era before modern genetics, people spoke of tainted blood, of God's displeasure manifesting in the bodies of princes. Whether or not they understood the science, they were not wrong. Centuries of inbreeding had produced fragile minds and strange anatomies. Ferdinand was simply the latest vessel of that legacy. But it was not only his body that was warped by this inheritance, it was his household. His father, Charles IV, was mild to the point of weakness. He preferred hunting and clockmaking to governance. Spain, once the greatest empire on earth, was sliding into irrelevance under his passive watch. His mother, Queen Maria Luisa, was of a very different nature. Ambitious, domineering, with a reputation for voracious appetites, both political and personal. Rumors spread quickly through Madrid that her true companion was not her husband at all, but Manuel de Godoy, a handsome guardsman who rose from obscurity to become Spain's de facto ruler. Imagine the lessons young Ferdinand absorbed as a boy wandering those echoing halls. He saw a father who was mocked for his incompetence, a mother whispered about for her infidelities, and a kingdom run not by a king but by a favorite. He grew up in an environment thick with humiliation and betrayal. From his earliest years, Ferdinand learned that power did not come from virtue or strength, but from manipulation, secrecy, and fear. As he moved from childhood into adolescence, another shadow began to fall over him, the shadow of his body's betrayal. At first, it was only odd murmurs from the physicians charged with examining the young prince's health. They noted that his member was developing in ways that defied proportion, that it was grotesquely large for his age, oddly shaped as though nature had stitched it together carelessly. By the time he reached his teenage years, the whispers had grown louder. Court doctors wrote in confidential notes, later buried in Vatican archives, that the royal anatomy was of extraordinary dimensions and peculiar form, such that intimate relations may prove most difficult. One physician, less delicate, described it as a billiard cue, thin at the base, grotesquely swollen at the extremity. In an age when male bodies were measured against the statues of ancient Greece, when refinement was equated with moderation, Ferdinand's deformity was not a gift but a stigma. The Greeks had admired proportion, harmony, small and symmetrical features that embodied control. In contrast, Ferdinand carried a grotesque exaggeration, a caricature of masculinity that made him, in the eyes of those who whispered, a freak of nature. The psychological impact on a young prince cannot be overstated. He was already surrounded by mockery, foreign ambassadors reporting on his mother's indiscretions, servants laughing at his father's weakness. Now even his most private self was an object of laughter. Servants passed jokes in hushed tones. Tutors exchanged glances. Courtiers wrote sly reports to foreign courts about the Spanish embarrassment. Ferdinand learned early that his very body was a source of ridicule. And with that knowledge, a seed was planted, a seed of resentment, paranoia, and cruelty. Spain at this time was already a nation teetering. The empire in the Americas was restless, its colonies whispering of independence. At home, the court was bloated with intrigue. The Enlightenment, with its talk of liberty and reason, was stirring rebellion across Europe. Against this backdrop, Ferdinand grew into a young man both malformed and malformed in spirit. He internalized the mockery, the sense of being deformed, and he turned it into suspicion. He would one day treat his subjects as he believed the world had treated him, with contempt, with mistrust, with brutality. His childhood was less a preparation for kingship than a slow forging in humiliation. Out of this crucible would step a man convinced that everyone mocked him, that no one could be trusted, and that to rule was not to serve but to destroy. The future king of Spain was already shaped, long before he wore a crown shaped by the twisted bloodline of his ancestors, and by the grotesque legacy hidden beneath his own skin. By the time Ferdinand entered adolescence, the deformity of his body was no longer a secret contained within the medical chambers of the palace. Whispers leaked like smoke through keyholes. Servants giggled behind closed doors. Courtiers made subtle jokes at banquets veiled in Latin wordplay that only the educated would catch. Yet Ferdinand could feel the laughter in their eyes. Ambassadors wrote home to their kings and queens about the strange condition of the Spanish air. Mockery became part of the air he breathed. For any child, being an object of ridicule is wounding. For a boy raised to believe himself chosen by God, destined to rule millions, it was unbearable. His private shame transformed into paranoia. He began to suspect mockery everywhere, in the formal lessons of his tutors, in the ceremonial bows of courtiers, even in the careful smiles of visiting dignitaries. A compliment on his swordsmanship might mask a sneer. A lesson in philosophy might contain an insult. Every gesture seemed laced with humiliation. The tutors noticed the change first. The prince who had once been quiet and brooding became vindictive. Servants who made the smallest mistake were punished harshly. When a page once stumbled into his chambers, unexpectedly catching a glimpse of the young Ferdinand in a state of undress, the punishment was shocking. The boy was not merely dismissed. He was flogged, and his family exiled from Madrid entirely. The message was unmistakable: no one could see Ferdinand's body and live comfortably again. From here, cruelty became habit. He began using his position not only to shield himself, but to strike out against anyone who might wound his pride. Guards who laughed too loudly in the courtyard found themselves reassigned to dangerous frontier outposts. Maids who whispered too long in corridors were dismissed under suspicion of gossip. Ferdinand was learning how power could be a weapon, a shield for his insecurity, and a blade against those who threatened it. This pattern was not unique to Ferdinand. History is filled with rulers whose personal deformities or humiliations twisted their temperaments. Richard III of England, described as misshapen, became infamous for ruthlessness. Emperor Claudius of Rome, mocked for his stammer and limp, grew into a ruler who cloaked his cunning beneath a mask of foolishness. But Ferdinand's case was different. His shame was tied not just to his body but to the most private and intimate aspect of manhood. Where others carried a limp or a crooked back, Ferdinand carried the humiliating certainty that he would be ridiculed as a man before he ever ruled as a king. The effect on his psychology was devastating. A boy who feels mocked will grow either into one who laughs at himself or one who seeks vengeance. Ferdinand became the latter. The humiliation he endured seeped into his worldview, souring his ability to trust. If servants laughed, they were traitors. If courtiers smiled, they were liars. Even if someone was loyal, Ferdinand's suspicion poisoned their loyalty. He began keeping mental lists of those he believed had mocked him, names he would carry into adulthood, waiting for the chance to exact revenge. The palace chaplain wrote in his memoirs of a disturbing incident when Ferdinand was about 16. He overheard two attendants chuckling together. Though the subject of their joke was entirely unrelated to him, Ferdinand stormed into the room convinced he was the target. He had both men beaten in front of him, watching silently as the punishment was carried out. The chaplain remarked that it was the first time he saw the prince smile without warmth, smile with cruelty. In this period, paranoia and secrecy hardened into his personality. He avoided genuine friendships, suspecting betrayal in every gesture. Even family bonds were warped. His mother's very public affair with Manuel de Godoy had already shown him that even within his household loyalty could not be trusted. Instead of learning to forgive, Ferdinand learned to wound first before others could wound him. The court, already a nest of intrigue, became a theatre for Ferdinand's growing bitterness. He would enter a room and scan it, convinced people stopped speaking because of him. He would interrogate servants about conversations they could not possibly have overheard. At times he withdrew entirely, sitting in darkened chambers for hours, muttering to himself, lost in suspicion. It was during these adolescent years that Ferdinand began to grasp the dangerous bargain of his position. His deformity left him powerless in one sense, mocked, humiliated, unable to control how his body betrayed him. But his title gave him immense power in another sense, and so he decided where he was powerless as a man he would compensate as a prince. His cruelty then was not random. It was compensation, a way of proving to himself and others that he could not be laughed at without consequence. Spain, meanwhile, offered no gentle counterbalance. The kingdom itself was wounded, mocked abroad for its decline. Once the master of the Americas and Europe, it had fallen into stagnation, its empire bleeding wealth to rebellion overseas, its court whispered about as decadent and incompetent. Ferdinand's private paranoia reflected Spain's public decline. Both heir and kingdom carried a sense of being mocked, of being diminished, of being surrounded by enemies. Thus, adolescence shaped Ferdinand into something darker than merely insecure. It turned him into a young man who believed mockery was treason, that humiliation must be met with cruelty, and that trust was weakness. This was no longer simply the paranoia of a boy ashamed of his body. It was the early mask of a tyrant. By the early years of the 19th century, Ferdinand was of marriageable age. The problem was obvious to those who served him most closely. How could such a man carrying such a deformity fulfill the fundamental duty of a king to sire heirs? The answer, as always in royal houses, was not found in medicine or morality, but In politics, a match was arranged. His bride would be Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily, his own first cousin, barely a teenager when the agreement was made. She was the daughter of Ferdinand IV of Naples, and Maria Carolina herself, the sister of the doomed Queen Marie Antoinette of France. Maria Antonia was raised in a court steeped in both Enlightenment learning and superstition, where her mother whispered of the dangers of revolution and the sanctity of Catholic monarchy. Like most royal girls of her time, she had been taught languages, music, and etiquette, but very little of what marriage would truly demand of her. When she arrived in Madrid in 1802, she carried with her a young girl's fantasies. She had been told her future husband was called El Deseado, the desired one, by his supporters. She imagined herself stepping into the role of queen beside a noble prince, strong and dignified, the kind of husband sung about in operas. The wedding that followed seemed to confirm those dreams. It was magnificent, the cathedral filled with incense and organ music, the streets of Madrid alive, with cheering crowds, balconies draped in silks. To the people it was a union of two great Bourbon houses, a promise of stability for Spain. To Maria Antonia it must have felt like the opening page of a fairy tale, but royal weddings end, and wedding nights begin. Behind the closed doors of the bedchamber the fairy tale collapsed into nightmare. Ferdinand's valet had already made unusual requests of Maria Antonia's attendants. Special cushions were brought in. Bottles of oils and salves were arranged on the side table. Implements that looked less like instruments of romance than of surgery. The ladies-in-waiting were told these preparations were customary for royal couples. In truth, they were desperate contrivances designed to make the impossible merely survivable. When Ferdinand entered the chamber, Maria Antonia was unprepared for what awaited her. She had no knowledge of his condition. She had been given only the vaguest instructions about the duties of marriage. When her eyes fell upon her husband's naked form, she screamed. Not the startled laugh of an embarrassed bride, but a cry of horror. A lady-in-waiting would later write that she cried out as though she had seen the devil himself. She backed away, pressed against the wall, pointing, sobbing, unable to comprehend what confronted her. Contemporary descriptions passed in whispers through the court, spoke of Ferdinand's member as resembling a grotesque club, thin as a reed at the base, swollen to a grotesque fist at the tip, curved unnaturally, covered with tissue growths that made it seem less human than monstrous. For Maria Antonia, raised in an era when young women were sheltered from even the basics of sexual knowledge, the shock was unimaginable. The scene that followed was not a wedding consummation but a medical procedure. Physicians already waiting in an adjoining room were summoned. They spoke to the trembling princess in hushed tones, urging her to be brave, explaining that the cushions and oils were necessary to protect her. Laudanum was administered to calm her terror, blurring the edge of her fear just enough for the ritual to proceed. What took place that night was less an act of union than a violation orchestrated by medicine and monarchy alike. From that night forward, Maria Antonia's life became a ritual of trauma. Each attempt at intimacy required preparation, like surgery. The custom cushions were always brought in, the oils applied, the physicians ready to intervene. She was given laudanum so often that her body soon craved it, the opium tincture becoming her only escape from the horror of her marriage bed. Court physicians recorded her trembling, her fainting, her hysterical sobbing before each encounter. For Ferdinand the effect was corrosive. He had entered marriage already paranoid, already haunted by his body's betrayal. To see his bride recoil in terror deepened his sense of humiliation. Instead of pity, he hardened. Instead of compassion, he turned her fear into another insult against his dignity. He began to see Maria Antonia not as a partner, not even as a person, but as an obstacle, a wife whose weakness mocked him, whose revulsion only confirmed his own deepest shame. And yet duty demanded heirs. The Spanish court waited impatiently for news of pregnancy. Physicians redoubled their efforts, timing encounters with lunar cycles, designing new supports and devices, searching for some combination of ritual and contrivance that might succeed. Maria Antonia submitted night after night, dosed and restrained her youth, drained into a cycle of terror and laudanum. This was the reality hidden behind the splendor of Bourbon Spain, a queen reduced to a trembling patient, a king reduced to a man furious at his own body, and a kingdom that placed the weight of dynastic survival on this grotesque spectacle. To the world outside, the royal couple smiled, paraded, and bowed, but inside the bedchamber of El Escorial, the reality was a living nightmare. Maria Antonia had come to Madrid expecting a fairy tale. What she found was a marriage that resembled more a prison, where her body became an experiment, her mind, the collateral damage of a dynasty cursed by its own blood. And Ferdinand, instead of finding solace in companionship, sank further into the paranoia and cruelty that would define his reign. Months passed, then years. Still no child came. For a royal couple, this was not merely a private disappointment, it was a national crisis. The duty of a queen was to produce an heir, the duty of a king was to ensure it. In Spain, where succession crises had repeatedly led to civil war every month without a pregnancy, was another spark near the powder keg. Ferdinand, desperate, turned first to his physicians. They devised ever more elaborate strategies to overcome his deformity. The custom cushions became heavier, the oils thicker, the procedures more intricate, but Maria Antonia, terrified and broken, began to resist. She would weep before entering the bedchamber, cling to her ladies-in-waiting, sometimes refuse altogether, and Ferdinand, already poisoned by suspicion, grew convinced that his wife's fear was deliberate rebellion, that she was sabotaging their marriage, and by extension Spain itself. The court records revealed disturbing details. When Maria Antonia recoiled, Ferdinand ordered artisans, saddlemakers, and leatherworkers to craft restraints. These were not symbolic but functional, designed to hold her in place during their encounters. The marriage bed began to resemble an operating table, its instruments made in the same workshops that produced the king's hunting gear. But physical force was not enough. Ferdinand's paranoia drove him to consult astrologers, alchemists, and mystics. He demanded that their attempts be timed with lunar cycles, planetary alignments, even the hours deemed auspicious by astrologers. The palace became a theater of strange rituals. Candles were lit according to secret patterns, prayers were chanted, incense of foreign herbs filled the chamber. Each attempt was staged like a ritual sacrifice, one in which the queen herself was both participant and victim. There was a brief flicker of hope. In 1804, Maria Antonia became pregnant. The news electrified the court. At last it seemed the grotesque efforts might bear fruit, but the pregnancy ended in miscarriage at 4 months. Physicians, careful with their words, blamed her delicate constitution. Privately they admitted what they could never write, that the violence of Ferdinand's encounters, even with medical aids, had damaged her body too severely to sustain life. 2 years later she conceived again. This time she carried the child nearly to term. But the labor was catastrophic. Hours of blood and agony ended with another dead infant, and a queen so shattered by the ordeal that she was never truly herself again. Court letters describe her as pale, gaunt, and hollow-eyed, walking the palace corridors like a ghost. Her laudanum dependency deepened into addiction, and she spent her final years in a haze, clinging to prayer, convinced she had been cursed by God. For Ferdinand, the miscarriages did not soften him. They hardened him. Instead of seeing his wife's suffering, he saw conspiracy. He accused Maria Antonia of poisoning herself, of secretly taking powders to prevent conception. He muttered that her revulsion had infected her womb with rebellion, that she had betrayed Spain as surely as a traitor on the battlefield. His paranoia fed upon her fragility, turning her from a victim into an enemy in his own mind. In the palace corridors, rumors multiplied. Some whispered that Maria Antonia had been poisoned not by herself but by Ferdinand. They pointed to the mysterious death of the palace apothecary, found lifeless in his chambers just days after the queen's decline. He had left behind a letter quickly seized by the king's agents and never seen again. Did it contain confessions of poison administered to the queen? Or was it something more damning, a record of Ferdinand's own deformity and the medical contraptions used in the royal bed? No one knew. The uncertainty only fed the gossip. Outside the palace walls, Spain trembled. In the Americas, colonies stirred with the first murmurs of independence. In Madrid, the streets grew restless with poverty and discontent. And yet, at the center of the kingdom, the monarch and his queen lived a nightmare of bedchamber, humiliations, miscarriages, and whispered accusations. Maria Antonia's last years were spent in despair. Letters from her confessor speak of a young woman obsessed with prayer, begging forgiveness for sins she could not name, convinced she had been chosen as the vessel of some divine punishment. She was only 21 when she died in 1807. Officially, the cause was listed as fever and frailty, but those who knew her whispered that she had been destroyed by trauma, laudanum, and a husband whose deformity had become her prison. Ferdinand's response to her death was as chilling as it was revealing. Publicly, he displayed grief, donning black, attending masses, weeping before crowds. Privately, he seemed almost relieved. Within weeks, he was already asking about new potential brides, narrowing his search to women proven fertile by prior childbirth. Maria Antonia, for all her suffering, had been discarded like a failed instrument. This was Ferdinand's lesson from marriage: wives were not partners, but tools, and if a tool failed, it must be replaced. Compassion had no place in his understanding of power. Cruelty, paranoia, and self-preservation were the only truths he recognized. And so, with Maria Antonia's death, the stage was set for the next chapter of Ferdinand's life, a chapter where his cruelty, once contained within the bedchamber, would spill outward, staining not only his marriages, but an entire kingdom. When Maria Antonia died in May of 1807, she was only 21 years old. The official cause was listed as fever, a delicate phrase used by court physicians to disguise the truth of her decline. In reality, she had wasted away from laudanum addiction, trauma and despair. The courtiers whispered that she had died of sorrow as much as of sickness, a bride consumed by the grotesque demands of her husband. To the public, Ferdinand donned the costume of grief. He appeared at masses in mourning, bowed his head at solemn ceremonies, and shed tears in front of the faithful. But behind closed doors his sorrow was strangely hollow. He displayed none of the anguish one might expect from a widower who had lost a partner. Instead, there was a sense of relief, as though Maria Antonia's death had freed him from a burdensome experiment. Within weeks his mind had already shifted. Advisors whispered of negotiations for a new marriage. Ferdinand insisted that his next bride must come from proven stock women who had already borne children. The problem, he told his inner circle, was not with him, but with Maria Antonia's weakness. If he was to try again, he would need a stronger vessel. The language revealed everything. His wives were not companions but instruments, tools to secure the succession. This coldness was not confined to his marriage. The years of humiliation in his private life had already taught Ferdinand a cruel lesson. People were either useful to him or dangerous to him, and those who were dangerous had to be eliminated. As a widower, he began to exercise his authority more aggressively. Servants who whispered too loudly were dismissed or vanished altogether. Guards who lingered near his chambers were sent to brutal posts in the colonies. The transformation was visible to those who watched him closely. The young man once mocked for his awkwardness now carried himself with menace. His paranoia became sharper, his punishments more arbitrary. The palace chaplains noted that he prayed more often, but his prayers were filled not with humility but with muttered curses against imagined enemies. Widowhood also freed Ferdinand to indulge more openly in the rituals and obsessions that had consumed him privately. He consulted astrologers to explain why his wife had failed to bear him an heir. He sought new alchemists who promised elixirs to reshape his body or enhance his virility. Charlatans swarmed Madrid, each offering miracle cures. Ferdinand swallowed powders of crushed pearls, ground rhinoceros horn, exotic herbs from the Americas, all useless, all expensive, and all eagerly consumed by a man desperate to master the curse of his own flesh. But beneath this desperation lurked something darker. The humiliations of his first marriage had carved bitterness into his soul. Where a gentler man might have turned to self-reflection, Ferdinand turned outward against others. He began to believe that mockery was everywhere, hidden in courtiers' laughter, in servants' glances, even in the sermons of priests, and he began to sharpen his cruelty into a weapon. There is a story preserved in the memoir of a palace official. A servant girl new to Madrid was caught giggling in the hallway after stumbling into a conversation about the king. She was never seen again. Her family received a letter weeks later saying she had been reassigned to distant service, but no one ever confirmed her arrival. Rumors spread that Ferdinand had her silenced for daring to laugh. This was Ferdinand's widowhood, a man shedding not grief but restraint. Maria Antonia had been a mirror of his own inadequacy, and now that mirror was broken. He felt freer, but not freer to heal, freer to lash out, freer to indulge his paranoia, freer to let the cruelty that had been growing inside him spill into the lives of others. And as he looked toward remarriage, he did not seek love nor companionship nor even dignity. He sought only a fertile womb. Spain's survival demanded heirs, and Ferdinand VII, wounded and warped though he was, would stop at nothing to produce them. By 1807, Ferdinand's private cruelties were beginning to spill into politics. Spain was in chaos. His father, King Charles IV, had grown more withdrawn, distracted by hunting trips, while the country's finances rotted. His mother, Queen Maria Luisa, was openly devoted to Manuel de Godoy, the young guardsman elevated to prime minister. To many Spaniards, it seemed as if the throne itself had been seized by an upstart, while the royal family became little more than a grotesque soap opera. For nobles and generals who despised Godoy, Ferdinand became their symbol of hope. They called themselves the Fernandinos, whispering that the prince would be the savior of Spain, a young king who would cast off his mother's lover and restore dignity to the crown. Pamphlets began to circulate painting him as El Deseado, the desired one. He was portrayed as pious, patriotic, and intelligent. The irony, of course, is that these qualities existed more on parchment than in reality. The conspiracy that grew around him was not merely about replacing one king with another. It was about restoring honor to Spain. For decades, the monarchy had been mocked across Europe, Charles IV as weak, Maria Luisa as scandalous, Godoy as corrupt. Ferdinand's backers believed that in him they might find redemption. They did not know that the man they pinned their hopes on was shaped by paranoia, humiliation, and cruelty. The so-called Escorial conspiracy took shape in the autumn of 1807. The plan was simple in its ambition. Ferdinand would overthrow his father, remove Godoy, and place himself upon the throne with the support of Napoleon Bonaparte, whose shadow was already falling over the Iberian Peninsula. But when the plot was uncovered, Ferdinand revealed his truest nature. Conspirators who had risked their lives for him expected loyalty, perhaps even defiance. Instead, Ferdinand crumbled. He confessed everything, betraying names, places, and details with shocking eagerness. He even wrote a letter to his parents begging forgiveness, prostrating himself in humiliating terms. Men who had called him the desired one now faced prison, exile, or disgrace, abandoned by the very prince they sought to make king. This betrayal was not an isolated incident. It was the pattern of Ferdinand's life. From childhood, he had learned to survive by turning shame outward, by sacrificing others to protect himself. The flogged page, the dismissed servants, the exiled families, all were smaller rehearsals for the great betrayals he would enact as an adult. His deformity had made him paranoid. His paranoia had made him cruel. And now his cruelty had taken political form. The Spanish court reeled. His father, weak though he was, could not ignore such treachery. His mother was humiliated by her son's willingness to throw noblemen under the carriage wheels. And Napoleon, observing all of this from beyond the Pyrenees, must have smiled. Here was a prince so desperate, so pliable, so cowardly, that he could be shaped into whatever instrument France required. And yet, despite the disgrace, Ferdinand emerged strangely untarnished in the eyes of the people. Propaganda had done its work. The image of El Deseado lingered carefully, curated by those who saw him as a symbol against Godoy. Ordinary Spaniards who despised the Queen and her lover looked to Ferdinand as a victim of corruption, not its source. They did not know the truth that the prince they dreamed would restore Spain's honor was already marked by cowardice and betrayal. The Escorial conspiracy revealed something vital about Ferdinand's character. He was incapable of loyalty, even to those who lifted him up. He would use men and discard them, as he had discarded his first wife. He could not see allies, only tools and obstacles. And every tool once broken was to be thrown away. From this moment, Ferdinand's path was sealed. He had shown Napoleon that he was pliable. He had shown Spain that he was dangerous. And he had shown himself that betrayal was not shameful but useful. The young prince who had grown up mocked in palace corridors had now learned the most important lesson of power: trust no one, betray everyone, and survive at any cost. As Ferdinand stumbled through political disgrace, another reality was unfolding in secret, one that would shape not only his marriages but his very sense of existence. His anatomy, already grotesque in youth, did not remain stable. Court physicians recorded with unease that it continued to change, swelling, distorting, curving in ways that defied medical expectation. Some whispered that he suffered from a rare disorder of the glands, others from a hormonal imbalance. Whatever the cause, the effect was clear. With every passing year, his body became less capable of normal intimacy. By the end of his 20s, what had once been merely an abnormality had become a monstrosity. Doctors wrote in clinical but horrified tones of peculiar growths and unnatural curvature. One noted that the organs seemed to have developed scar tissue, as though Ferdinand himself had attempted crude interventions, perhaps even self-surgery, in his desperation. If true, the thought of the prince alone in his chambers, blade in hand, trying to cut away the parts of his body he despised, is almost unbearable. But medicine in early 19th century Spain was woefully ill-equipped to address such a condition. The physicians could prescribe opiates, bleeding poultices of herbs, or bizarre concoctions of powdered gems and animal horn. None of it could alter the fundamental reality. Instead, their task shifted not to cure Ferdinand but to adapt to him. To make possible what nature had made impossible. And so the palace workshops became laboratories of perverse invention. The same artisans who crafted saddles for royal horses and armor for ceremonial guards were summoned to design marital aids. Cushions of special design, contraptions of leather and silk, supports of wood covered in velvet, all to hold and restrain, to angle and compress, to make encounters survivable for his wives. The workshop smelled of resin polish and leather, but the objects produced there were not tools of war or courtly ceremony. They were instruments meant to tame the grotesque anatomy of the king in waiting. Those craftsmen were sworn to secrecy, yet they could not be blind. They saw what they were making, and some must have whispered to their families in nervous half-sentences. Rumors trickled from the workshops into the taverns of Madrid, strange devices being ordered by the prince, contraptions more suited to torture than to pleasure. By the time Ferdinand ascended the throne, his reputation was already a mixture of paranoia and dark curiosity. For Ferdinand himself, the psychological toll deepened. Each new device reminded him of his failure, each physician's report a mirror held up to his shame. Instead of healing, he embraced cruelty as a shield. He punished anyone who questioned him, lashed out at servants who so much as glanced at him the wrong way. Court officials began to fear not only his rage but his secrecy. They knew that behind the closed doors of his chambers, something monstrous was taking place, something no royal etiquette could disguise. Medical historians looking back have suggested possible diagnoses: extreme Peyronie's disease, congenital malformations, even hormonal disorders that caused abnormal growth. But for Ferdinand and his contemporaries, such terms meant nothing. To them it was a curse, a grotesque inheritance of Bourbon inbreeding, proof that Spain's ruling bloodline was rotting from within. And yet, rather than humbling him, the deformity inflamed his arrogance. He convinced himself that his wives' fear was weakness, that their revulsion was betrayal. He began to believe that their suffering was a test of loyalty, proof of whether they were worthy to be queens. The devices in the workshops were not in his mind a shameful necessity, they were instruments of his authority. Thus his personal tragedy fused with his politics. The same cruelty he inflicted on his wives, he would soon inflict on his subjects. The same paranoia that ruled his bedchamber would rule his court. In trying to overcome the limitations of his body, Ferdinand was forging a character that would make him one of the most feared and despised kings in Spanish history. In 1808, the humiliations of Ferdinand's private life were joined by a humiliation of state. Napoleon Bonaparte, master of Europe, turned his attention to Spain. Through manipulation, intrigue and force, he compelled Ferdinand to abdicate. The man once hailed as El Deseado, the desired one, was reduced not to king but to prisoner. The French transported him north, away from the heat and dust of Madrid, to the Château of Valençay, a damp and isolated estate in central France. Here, while Spain bled in rebellion, Ferdinand became the captive guest of Napoleon. And just as Spanish physicians had studied him in secrecy, so too did French doctors, this time with far less restraint. The Napoleonic archives, unearthed centuries later, contain chilling reports. French physicians described the Spanish prince with clinical detachment, noting that his anatomy exceeds normal dimensions to such a degree that functional union with a woman appears improbable. They measured, sketched, and theorized. One report compared his deformity to a mythological weapon, more club than instrument. Another suggested his condition was the result of a rare conflation of inherited disorders, creating a perfect storm of malformation. Ferdinand, once the hope of conspirators in Madrid, had become a medical specimen. And the irony was not lost on him. He had been mocked in childhood by servants, mocked in youth by his wives, and now in captivity he was mocked by the very doctors who examined him. His body, which he had tried so desperately to hide, was being catalogued, dissected in ink and parchment, circulated through medical circles in Paris. Meanwhile, Spain was on fire. Guerrilla fighters in the mountains waged desperate war against French troops. Whole villages were massacred. The Peninsular War drained France of men and money, turning Iberia into a graveyard for Napoleon's armies. And yet while his people died in muddy trenches, Ferdinand spent his exile consumed by the same obsession that had haunted him since youth: how to master his deformity and produce an heir. Letters survive from this period, written in Ferdinand's own hand, sent to courts across Europe. He pleaded with foreign royals for potential brides, explaining, though never in full detail, his special circumstances. He promised that physicians were working on remedies, that contraptions had been devised, that marriage with him would still serve dynastic interests. These letters reveal a man astonishingly detached from the realities of war. While Spaniards bled for his restoration, he was planning his next wedding night. The French, of course, saw through him. To Napoleon, Ferdinand was not a partner but a pawn, a weak and pliable man who could be used to justify French interference in Spain. Napoleon described him as a fool and a coward, and with reason. The same pattern that had defined his life repeated itself in captivity. When pressed, Ferdinand betrayed allies, abandoned principles, and grovelled for survival. And yet, paradoxically, his image in Spain only grew brighter. To the rebels, he was the rightful king, a symbol of resistance against the French invader. They called him El Deseado, still never knowing that while they fought and died, their idol sat in Valençay, scribbling letters about wives and heirs, submitting to humiliating medical examinations, more prisoner of his own body than of Napoleon's guards. In truth, Ferdinand's captivity revealed the essence of his character. He could endure humiliation if it promised him survival. He could betray anyone if it preserved his chance at the throne. He could ignore the suffering of his people because his gaze was fixed always inward on the deformity that ruled his mind, as surely as Napoleon ruled Europe. When he returned to Spain in 1814, restored to his throne by the very rebels who had fought in his name, the people wept and threw flowers, shouting, "Long live the king!" They believed they had rescued a monarch worth dying for. But in reality they had restored a man who had spent 6 years not plotting their salvation but brooding over his anatomy, obsessing over heirs and bowing before French physicians who treated him as a grotesque curiosity. Spain thought it had brought home a savior. In truth, it had brought home a man broken by captivity, embittered by humiliation, and determined to take out his shame on the kingdom that had sacrificed everything for him. When Ferdinand returned to Spain in 1814, the reception was unlike anything Europe had seen in generations. The Peninsular War had left the country bled white. Villages were burned, cities scarred, thousands dead. Families had sacrificed everything in a desperate grinding war against Napoleon's armies. And through it all the people had whispered the name of a king they had never truly known, El Deseado, the Desired One. As his carriage rolled through the streets of Madrid, crowds wept openly. Women threw flowers, children knelt in the dust, old men raised trembling hands in blessing. Bells rang from church towers and priests declared from pulpits that God himself had restored Spain's rightful king. Some who had lost husbands or sons in the war claimed it was worth the sacrifice if only to see their monarch return. The spectacle was a kind of collective hallucination born not of knowledge but of longing. The Spanish people, humiliated by years of occupation, desperately needed a savior. They projected onto Ferdinand every virtue they wished their king would possess: courage, wisdom, compassion. They did not know that the man smiling stiffly from the carriage window was none of those things. For Ferdinand himself, the moment of triumph was hollow. As he rode through streets lined with cheering subjects, his thoughts were elsewhere, not on the dead, not on rebuilding a broken kingdom, but on the question that had haunted him for decades: how to secure an heir. His return to the throne was for him an opportunity not for governance but for another attempt at procreation. The ink on his decrees of restoration was barely dry before he commissioned artisans to design a new suite of marital devices, more elaborate and costly than anything attempted before. This grotesque dissonance defined his reign from its very first day. The people rejoiced, believing their king would reward their sacrifices. Ferdinand, however, saw their adoration as a shield behind which he could pursue his private obsessions. The empire already collapsing in the Americas could wait. The finances of the state already ruined could be ignored. What mattered most was finding a wife who might endure what his first had not, and at last give him the child who would secure his dynasty. Contemporary observers were struck by the oddness of the new king. Foreign ambassadors reported home that Ferdinand, though outwardly polite, seemed distracted, his gaze turned always inward, as if fixed upon some private torment. Ministers found him capricious, alternately elated and despondent. Courtiers noticed that he spent more time consulting physicians and craftsmen than generals or economists. To many it was baffling. To those who knew his secret, it was not baffling at all. The return of Ferdinand marked what Spaniards would later call La Década Ominosa, the ominous decade. Historians usually describe it as a period of political repression, censorship, and restored absolutism. But beneath those political terms lay a deeper truth. The ominousness was not only in Ferdinand's tyranny, but in his obsession. His sexual dysfunction had fused with his political dysfunction. His paranoia in the bedchamber became paranoia in the council chamber. His cruelty toward wives foreshadowed cruelty toward subjects. And so while the streets of Madrid echoed with cheers, the palace was already filling with craftsmen's tools, physicians' consultations, and the strange preparations for yet another doomed marriage. Spain believed it had brought home a savior. What it had truly welcomed back was a man incapable of empathy, consumed by shame, determined to bend others' wives, ministers, subjects to the demands of his grotesque condition. The flowers withered quickly. The cheering faded. What remained was Ferdinand, his deformity, his paranoia, and a kingdom about to learn that the desired one would soon become their despised king. In 1816, 2 years after his triumphant return, Ferdinand sought another wife. Spain was exhausted, yet the pressure for an heir was relentless. His first marriage had ended in tragedy. His second was arranged with the same cold calculation that had always guided the Bourbons: strengthen dynastic ties, secure succession, restore stability through the body of a queen. The chosen bride was Maria Isabel of Portugal, his own niece, daughter of King John VI of Portugal. Once again, cousin married cousin, continuing the chain of inbreeding that had already poisoned the dynasty. Maria Isabel was only 19 when she arrived in Madrid. She was described by contemporaries as gentle and pious, a young woman with a shy smile and the hopeful demeanor of someone raised to believe in duty above self. Like Maria Antonia before her, she had been given almost no preparation for what awaited her in marriage. Her education was religious and courtly, not biological. She knew only that her duty was to obey, to provide heirs, and to uphold the dignity of the crown. The wedding was a spectacle of Baroque splendor. The streets of Madrid, still scarred from war, bloomed for a day with banners and flowers. Priests chanted blessings, nobles feasted, and the people cheered for their king and new queen. Ferdinand, dressed in cloth of gold, stood at the altar beside a nervous but smiling Isabel. For a moment Spain seemed to believe in fairy tales again, that this union might heal wounds, that this queen might bring peace and heirs to a fractured kingdom. But behind the palace doors the nightmare began again. The wedding night repeated the same horror that had destroyed Maria Antonia. The contraptions were prepared: cushions, oils, leather supports, devices crafted in secret by palace artisans. Isabel, naive and trusting, could not have imagined their purpose. When Ferdinand revealed himself, her innocence shattered. Witnesses wrote that her cries echoed down the palace corridors not with joy but with terror. Servants found the chamber in chaos, blood-stained sheets, broken furniture, the unmistakable signs of violence disguised as duty. From that night forward, Isabel was never the same. Courtiers noted that she developed a nervous stutter. She flinched whenever Ferdinand entered a room. Her ladies-in-waiting reported episodes of hysteria, fits of trembling, sudden screams in the night. Nightmares so vivid that she would wake, crying for deliverance. What the physicians of the time called nervous illness we would now recognize as trauma. Ferdinand, instead of compassion, responded with paranoia. He convinced himself that Isabel's fear was not the result of his deformity, but evidence of betrayal. He suspected her of conspiring with Portugal, of mocking him behind closed doors, of seeking to humiliate him by feigning revulsion. He had her correspondence intercepted, her food tested for poison, her chambers searched. What had begun as a marital tragedy became political suspicion. The pressure to produce an heir mounted. When Isabel's health began to decline, physicians reported episodes of phantom pregnancy periods, when she exhibited signs of conception but no child developed. Each false hope drove Ferdinand into a frenzy, pacing outside her chambers, muttering prayers and curses, waiting for a miracle that never came. Servants whispered that the palace itself seemed haunted, the desired one, stalking the corridors like a ghost, his wife wasting away in terror, both trapped in a grotesque parody of marriage. In 1818, only 2 years into the union, Isabel died. The official cause was listed as nervous exhaustion, though those closest to her believed her spirit had simply broken. Some whispered of poison, others of self-harm. Her confessor recorded that her final words were a prayer of thanks for the peace of death. Ferdinand's reaction revealed the depths of his paranoia. He did not mourn. Instead, he declared she must have been murdered by conspirators who wished to deny him an heir. He ordered multiple autopsies, demanded evidence of poison, and even had Isabel's attendants arrested on suspicion of treason. He commissioned a death mask which he kept in his chambers, speaking to it in private as though the lifeless plaster face might answer him. For Spain, the second marriage was another grotesque failure. For Ferdinand, it was proof that women were unreliable, conspiratorial, weak. And yet, despite 2 dead queens, he still believed the problem was not with him. The hunt for another bride would soon begin. By 1819, Ferdinand had buried 2 wives, both taken young, both broken by the grotesque reality of life beside him. Yet Spain still demanded an heir. The court, weary of whispers and scandal, sought another bride. But the pool of candidates was shrinking. European princesses, forewarned by rumors and court physicians' whispers, were reluctant to tie their fates to the King of Spain. Marriage to Ferdinand was no longer seen as a prize but as a danger. Eventually his agents found a match, Maria Josepha, Amalia of Saxony. She was 24 older than his previous brides and described as devout, serious, and obedient. Her family, struggling with debts and political weakness after the Napoleonic Wars, was willing to overlook Ferdinand's infamous reputation in exchange for a lucrative alliance. For Saxony, it was survival. For Ferdinand, it was another attempt to fulfill the dynastic duty that had so far destroyed every woman he married. From the beginning, Maria Josepha approached her marriage differently. She had been better prepared, or at least better warned by her physicians in Saxony. She arrived in Madrid with her own medical attendants, and even her own collection of devices designed with clinical precision to assist in difficult conjugal circumstances. She did not carry Isabel's naive innocence or Maria Antonia's fairy tale illusions. She came as a woman braced for ordeal, treating her role less as romance than as obligation, even as a kind of medical assignment. The wedding itself was subdued compared to Ferdinand's earlier unions. The Spanish court, scarred by 2 funerals, did not throw itself into celebration with the same extravagance. There were fewer feasts, fewer foreign dignitaries, fewer illusions. The ceremony carried a grim undertone, as if everyone sensed the likely outcome. Their marital life quickly settled into a routine that shocked even hardened courtiers. Intimacy became a scheduled procedure, planned with the precision of a medical experiment. Physicians were always present, timing encounters, recording results. Maria Josepha herself kept journals noting dates, techniques, outcomes. Her letters, preserved in Saxon archives, read more like laboratory notes than personal confessions. Attempt performed with cushion number 3. Duration unsatisfactory. Patient suffered distress. For Ferdinand, this clinical detachment was intolerable. Already insecure, already haunted by mockery, he interpreted her precision as insult. He began to suspect that Maria Josepha was not a wife but a spy, that her records were not for medicine but for foreign courts. His paranoia flared. He ordered her correspondence intercepted, her servants questioned. He became convinced that she was cataloguing his failures to humiliate him internationally. At the same time, Spain itself was collapsing. The colonies in the Americas were breaking away one by one: Mexico, Argentina, Chile. Independence movements carried banners that mocked Ferdinand, depicting him as a weak and impotent tyrant whose body mirrored his kingdom's decay. While the empire crumbled, the king sat in his palace, surrounded by physicians and devices, consumed not by politics but by the endless ritual of failed procreation. Cabinet meetings were postponed when he was having a difficult week with Maria Josepha. Ministers fumed while their monarch consulted mystics about the proper lunar phase for conception. Maria Josepha endured this life with stoic resignation. She was less hysterical than Isabel, less romantic than Maria Antonia. Instead, she became almost ghost-like, moving through her duties with the detachment of someone who had already accepted her fate. Her attendants described her as polite but distant, her eyes dull, her health waning. She lost weight, often skipped meals, and spent long hours in prayer, clutching a rosary as though it were the only anchor in a court that felt like a prison. And still the attempts continued. The cushions were adjusted, the devices redesigned, the physicians replaced. Each failure deepened Ferdinand's paranoia. Each moment of resistance from his wife became in his mind treason. He began to accuse her not only of betrayal but of witchcraft, of conspiring with hidden forces to deny him an heir. For Spain, the irony was bitter. While generals bled on battlefields across the Atlantic, while peasants starved in their villages, while revolution smoldered at home, their king's greatest energies were consumed in the bedroom laboratory of the royal palace. The fate of a kingdom was secondary to the fate of his anatomy. By the late 1822, after nearly a decade of these clinical humiliations, Maria Josepha at last became pregnant. For Ferdinand, it was a miracle, the vindication of years of suffering. For the court, it was a fragile hope that Spain might finally escape the looming crisis of succession. But what followed would prove as tragic as everything that came before. While Ferdinand obsessed over chambers and cushions, Spain itself was slipping away. The empire that had once stretched across oceans was breaking apart piece by piece, and the king did little to stop it. From Mexico to Argentina, colonies that had filled Spain's treasuries for centuries now declared independence. What had begun as whispers during the Napoleonic Wars became roaring revolutions carried on the banners of men like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín. The timing was cruel. Spain, exhausted by years of invasion and civil war, could not spare the soldiers or money to crush rebellion across an ocean. And Ferdinand, newly restored, spent his energy not on reforming the treasury or rallying armies, but on his own grotesque quest for heirs. While provinces starved and soldiers deserted, he sat with physicians debating oils and salves, summoning mystics to chart the stars, and punishing a wife who flinched from his touch. Revolutionary pamphlets mocked him mercilessly. In Mexico and Buenos Aires, caricatures circulated showing Ferdinand as a swollen, impotent tyrant, his anatomy exaggerated to monstrous proportions. To rebels, his deformity was proof of divine judgment. Spain was cursed, they said, with a king unfit to rule, a monarch whose private shame mirrored the corruption of his dynasty. The very rumors Ferdinand tried so desperately to contain in Madrid had become weapons in distant colonies, and indeed the parallel was difficult to ignore. Just as Ferdinand's body was misshapen, grotesque, and incapable of true union, so too was his monarchy deformed by inbreeding, bloated with corruption, incapable of binding together an empire that was tearing itself apart. His private dysfunction became a metaphor for Spain's decline. At home, resentment grew. The war had left villages in ruin, peasants, hungry soldiers unpaid. Yet the king poured fortunes into secret workshops, commissioning ever more elaborate contraptions to aid his marital failures. Foreign physicians were brought at staggering cost, while ordinary Spaniards buried their dead without bread for the living. Ministers who dared suggest reform were silenced. Newspapers that criticized the crown were censored. Ferdinand's paranoia, once confined to his bedchamber, now infected his governance. The Spanish people who had once greeted him with tears of joy began to turn. The desired one became in whispers the despised one. His tyranny grew harsher as his popularity waned. He restored the Inquisition, unleashed spies across the cities, and filled prisons with men accused of spreading slander against the crown. Slander that was often no more than repeating what everyone already knew, that their king was broken in, body and spirit. And all the while Maria Josepha withered under the strain. She endured scheduled intimacies like a patient enduring surgery. She suffered miscarriages and false hopes, phantom pregnancies and failed attempts. And though she bore the humiliation silently, her health declined. She became gaunt, pale, her once serious eyes now dull with resignation. The palace was filled not with joy but with an air of slow suffocation. For Ferdinand, each colonial loss only deepened his obsession. He convinced himself that producing a son would restore Spain's strength, that an heir would redeem his failures. But as news arrived of colonies declaring independence, his chamber rituals grew more desperate, more bizarre. He turned to exorcists, to holy relics, even to bizarre foreign practices brought by charlatans who promised fertility through ritual chants and incense. Nothing worked. By the mid-1822nd, Spain's empire in the Americas was gone. 3 centuries of conquest and plunder dissolved in a single generation, and still the king had no heir. To the outside world, the collapse of Spain was political, military, economic. To those inside the palace, it was also deeply personal. The empire had rotted from the same disease that afflicted its monarch, a grotesque inheritance, a legacy of decay, a deformity both private and national. The people who had once died for Ferdinand now muttered curses when his name was spoken. The soldiers who had once hailed him as savior now returned from the Americas broken and bitter, asking why they had bled for a king who could not even protect his own throne. In the end, the image of Ferdinand as savior dissolved, leaving only the reality, a tyrant whose body, like his kingdom, was falling apart. After nearly a decade of barren ritual, whispered humiliation and clinical despair, the Spanish court finally received news it had almost stopped believing possible. In 1829, Queen Maria Josepha was pregnant. For Ferdinand, it was a miracle, proof at last that his cursed anatomy could fulfill its divine duty. For the court, it was a fragile rope of hope dangling over an abyss. And for Spain, crumbling in poverty and defeat, it was treated as a sign that God had not abandoned them entirely. The king's joy was so feverish it bordered on madness. He doubled the guards around Maria Josepha's chambers, convinced that enemies would try to sabotage the pregnancy. He summoned the finest physicians from across Europe, Italians, French, Germans, each promising to oversee the queen's care. Priests were brought daily to bless her rooms, sprinkling holy water on doorframes and bedding. Even relics were placed beneath her pillows, fragments of saints' bones, crucifixes, said to ward off the evil eye. But Ferdinand's paranoia poisoned even these preparations. He insisted that the queen's meals be tasted 3 times over, not only for poison but for hidden toxins of the spirit. He interrogated her ladies-in-waiting about every movement, every word. He ordered astronomers to chart the stars, demanding that their encounters and prayers be synchronized with favorable planetary alignments. Maria Josepha, already frail from years of physical ordeal, was smothered under the weight of rituals that transformed pregnancy into a kind of siege. For a few months hope bloomed. The queen's belly swelled. The court dared to whisper about the possibility of a prince. But by the 7th month, complications appeared. Maria Josepha began to bleed. Physicians called it a disturbance of the womb. Today we would recognize it as placental abruption, a condition dangerous but survivable with modern care. In Ferdinand's Madrid, however, medicine was still chained to superstition and confusion. The delivery, when it came, was a nightmare. On the 18th of May, 1829, Maria Josepha went into premature labor. Ferdinand insisted on being present, pacing and muttering prayers, shouting orders at physicians who begged him to leave. The chamber filled with cries, blood, and the suffocating smell of incense. Hours later, a baby girl was born, tiny, fragile, fighting for breath. She lived only a few hours before succumbing. Maria Josepha survived the birth, but only barely. Fever followed and infection soon spread. Within 3 weeks, she too was dead. The court sank into mourning, but Ferdinand's reaction was grotesque. He refused to allow the bodies to be buried. For days, the corpses of mother and child were kept under guard in the palace, while Ferdinand demanded that physicians attempt resuscitation. He ordered prayers, rituals, even bizarre experiments with heat and stimulants, as though sheer will might reverse death. Servants whispered that the stench became unbearable, that candles burned constantly to mask it. Only after a week of this macabre charade did Ferdinand finally permit burial. The tragedy broke what little stability remained in the Spanish court. The ministers despaired. The nobles muttered that the king was cursed. The people whispered that God himself had judged their monarch. Abroad, foreign ambassadors wrote home with barely disguised disgust, describing a king who clung to corpses while his empire collapsed. For Ferdinand, however, the lesson was not humility. It was fury. He became convinced that his enemies had somehow engineered the death, poisoning his wife or invoking dark arts to destroy the child. He demanded investigations, arrests, interrogations. Once again, a personal tragedy became a public purge, with innocents swept away by his paranoia. Maria Josepha's death was more than the loss of a queen. It was the extinguishing of the last real hope that Spain might stabilize through a natural heir. The desired one had now buried 3 wives, and the dynasty stood on the edge of disaster. And yet Ferdinand was not finished. Even as he mourned or pretended to mourn, he was already planning another marriage, another attempt, another cycle of suffering. Spain itself seemed to mirror the tragedy. A once great empire, now emaciated, bleeding, staggering through endless failures, clinging to rituals and superstition instead of facing reality. The king's bedchamber had become a metaphor for the kingdom, grotesque, desperate, and ultimately barren. The death of Maria Josepha might have broken another man. For Ferdinand, it simply marked the beginning of a new search. By 1829 he was 45 years old, plagued by illness, paranoia and the ridicule of Europe. He had buried 3 wives and still had no heir. Spain was collapsing into poverty, its empire lost, its people restless. And yet the king's gaze remained fixed on the same obsession that had consumed him since youth, to produce a child who could continue his line. The court scrambled for options. Many European houses hesitated. Who would risk a daughter in Madrid, where queens seemed to wither and die? At last the choice fell upon Maria Cristina, of Naples and Sicily, a 23-year-old princess from the Bourbon branch of southern Italy. She was Ferdinand's niece by marriage, another link in the endless chain of cousin unions that had deformed the dynasty. Maria Cristina arrived in Spain with intelligence and pragmatism. Unlike Ferdinand's previous brides, she was not naive. She understood the whispers, the stories of screaming wedding nights, the rumors of contraptions and laudanum. She also carried a secret: she was already pregnant, almost certainly by another man. The irony was staggering. Ferdinand, desperate for an heir of his own blood, was about to claim a child that could not possibly be his. The marriage in December 1829 was a farce dressed in solemnity. The cathedral gleamed with gold, choirs sang, nobles bowed, but all eyes flicked nervously to the visibly pregnant bride. No one dared speak the truth aloud. Spain needed an heir, and Ferdinand needed a miracle. If the child in Maria Cristina's womb could be passed off as his, then the fiction of legitimacy would serve the dynasty. The lie was too convenient to challenge. When Isabella was born in 1830, Madrid erupted in joy. Cannons roared, bells rang, priests proclaimed the birth as divine favor. To the people the curse seemed broken. To Ferdinand the irony was almost unbearable. He adored the infant, gazing for hours at her small face, yet he was tormented by doubt. Was she his? Did she carry his blood? Or was she living proof of his greatest failure? This contradiction gnawed at him. On one hand, Isabella was the heir he had longed for, the answer to decades of humiliation. On the other, she was a daily reminder that his body had betrayed him, that another man's seed had succeeded where he had failed. He became obsessed with her features, commissioning endless portraits, comparing her infant face with his own, with Maria Cristina's with imagined rivals. He quizzed physicians and genealogists, demanding proof of her legitimacy, though no such proof was possible. His paranoia turned cruel. Maria Cristina was subjected to constant surveillance. Guards patrolled her chambers, her letters were opened and read, her conversations were reported word for word. Ferdinand burst into her rooms at night, convinced he would catch her in acts of betrayal. He drilled peepholes into the walls, spending hours watching her nurse pray or simply sit in silence. She lived in a cage of eyes, her every gesture scrutinized by a husband whose jealousy had rotted into madness. For Ferdinand, the arrival of Maria Cristina did not bring peace but new torments. His obsession with producing an heir had been fulfilled, but not by him. The irony was too sharp, too cruel. It poisoned even his moments of tenderness toward the child, turning love into suspicion, joy into paranoia. For Spain, however, Isabella's birth represented fragile stability. The people celebrated as though their suffering had meaning, as though the cycle of death and failure had been broken. In reality, the dynasty rested on a deception. The little girl who would be queen carried not the blood of Ferdinand's grotesque body, but the shadow of another man's places. In this contradiction lay the seed of Spain's future conflicts. A king broken by paranoia, a queen trapped in constant surveillance, and a child whose legitimacy was uncertain. Outwardly, the monarchy seemed restored. Inwardly, it was as deformed as Ferdinand himself. By the early 1832, Ferdinand's life was a labyrinth of suspicion. His health was failing, his body swollen with gout, his mind eroded by decades of obsession and cruelty. Yet even as death crept closer, his paranoia only deepened. He had gained an heir in Isabella, but instead of calming him, it sharpened his anxieties. To Ferdinand, Isabella was both salvation and betrayal, proof of his dynasty's survival and proof of his personal failure. He turned his gaze upon Maria Cristina with unrelenting suspicion. She was watched at every moment. Guards rotated daily so no man could grow too familiar with her. Her correspondence was intercepted, her meals tasted in elaborate rituals that delayed dining for hours. Ferdinand ordered that tasters wait half an hour between sampling and serving, convinced of slow-acting poisons. Some servants collapsed from nervous strain, trembling under his hawk-like stare, which only confirmed to him that plots were real. He drilled spy holes into the walls of her chambers, spending hours peering through them, his eye pressed to the plaster, as she prayed, nursed, or wept silently. Maria Cristina moved through her rooms like a prisoner, every gesture controlled, every expression carefully measured. Her letters to Naples, later discovered, speak of unbearable pressure. I breathe as though in a cage of glass where each breath is observed. The surveillance extended beyond the queen. Ministers were tested with traps of loyalty. Ferdinand would deliberately contradict himself in private meetings, watching who dared correct him. Any contradiction was read as treason. Courtiers whispered in code, careful to keep their voices low even in their own apartments. A climate of terror spread through the palace. Conversations became dangerous. A wrong glance could cost one's post or one's life. Even religious rituals were not spared from suspicion. When Maria Cristina increased her devotion, spending hours in prayer lighting candles before sacred images, Ferdinand grew convinced it was not piety but secret communication with foreign Catholic powers. He saw conspiracies everywhere, in the arrangement of flowers on an altar, in the choice of books on a shelf, in the compliments of ambassadors. The irony was grotesque. While Spain starved its treasury, drained its soldiers, demoralized its king, obsessed over imaginary poisons and phantom conspiracies. While Europe advanced into industrial modernity, Madrid's palace halls echoed with the mutterings of a monarch who believed his wife's sighs were coded messages. Maria Cristina bore the strain with remarkable endurance. She cultivated an outward serenity, smiling at public events, carrying herself with regal composure. But in private she was breaking. Her ladies-in-waiting noted her trembling hands, her hair falling out in clumps, her sudden tears. She lived in constant fear, not of assassination, but of her own husband, the man who should have been her protector. Foreign ambassadors reported home with unease. They described Ferdinand as erratic, suspicious, consumed by imaginary plots. They warned that Spain's monarchy was unstable, its court a nest of paranoia. Some powers quietly began preparing for Spain's collapse, calculating that the fragmentation of the kingdom might be preferable to continued rule under such a broken king. For Ferdinand, however, the world outside mattered little. His final years were spent not in governance but in surveillance. He paced the halls of his palace like a jailer guarding his own wife. He interrogated servants, muttered about treason in the kitchens, demanded new precautions, new locks, new rituals of safety. His paranoia had become not just a feature of his character, but the very rhythm of his reign. And beneath it all, the same grotesque irony remained. A king once called the Desired One, who had destroyed 3 wives, clung to a 4th with suspicion, and treated a child who might not even be his as both jewel and thorn. His paranoia was the natural end of his life's pattern. Humiliation turned to cruelty, cruelty turned to suspicion, suspicion turned to madness. Spain's fate, like that of Maria Cristina, was to live in the cage of his fear. By 1832, Ferdinand was unraveling. His body, abused by years of stress, paranoia, and grotesque rituals, began to betray him more openly. Gout inflamed his joints until he could barely walk. His hands trembled, his digestion failed, and court physicians recorded long bouts of nervous agitation. Nights brought no rest. He stalked the palace halls, muttering about plots, his face pale and drawn by candlelight. His speeches, once stiff but coherent, turned rambling. Ministers reported that he lost his train of thought mid-sentence, veering into accusations of treason or conspiracies no one else could see. At times he would recall past humiliations as though they had happened the day before, naming servants long dead as if they still mocked him. The paranoia that had begun in childhood had now consumed what remained of his reason. Maria Cristina bore the brunt of this decline. The midnight raids into her chambers grew more frequent. Sometimes Ferdinand burst in with guards, demanding her body be examined for traces of poison. Other times he accused her of whispering to Isabella, planting treason in their daughter's young mind. Even moments of tenderness curdled into cruelty. He would cradle Isabella 1 hour and interrogate her attendants, the next demanding to know who might be influencing her. The court itself became a theatre of absurdity. Ministers, aware that the king's mind was slipping, learned to nod solemnly at his rants, then quietly undo his orders once he left the room. Loyalists who had defended him in earlier years began to distance themselves, calculating how much longer Spain could endure. Diplomats sent anxious reports back to their capitals, warning that the Spanish monarchy was unstable, its ruler increasingly unfit. And yet Ferdinand clung to power with a tyrant's grip. He ordered more purges, more investigations, more spies. He saw conspiracies in the choice of a wine vintage, in the pattern of a servant's footsteps, in the very air of his palace. Those around him learned to live in silence. Conversations were carried in whispers. Courtiers moved through corridors like shadows. The king's madness had become the law of the land. Physicians, too, were trapped. They wrote reports describing his decline but softened their language, fearing his wrath. Privately, some admitted that nothing could be done. The king's condition was not simply physical, it was the slow collapse of a man consumed by his own obsessions. Decades of paranoia had eaten away his reason, as surely as disease had eaten away his body. Outside the palace, Spain waited. The people who had once hailed Ferdinand as El Deseado now muttered prayers for his death. Farmers cursed him as they buried children lost to famine. Veterans of the Peninsular War spat at his name, remembering the sacrifices made for a king who had repaid them with tyranny. Even among the clergy, once his staunchest defenders, there was fatigue. Better a child on the throne, one bishop reportedly said, than this shadow of a man. In his final months, Ferdinand drifted between lucidity and delirium. Sometimes he issued commands with sharpness, demanding more spies, more reports. Other times he called out to his dead wives as if their ghosts still lingered in the palace halls. On his worst nights he ordered guards to stand ready for assassins who never came, staring at shadows as though they carried daggers. The king who had once been mocked for his deformity was now pitied for his decline. His enemies no longer needed to conspire. His body itself was the assassin killing him, slowly stripping him of dignity. Yet in those last days, even as his flesh failed, Ferdinand clung to the obsessions that had defined his life: his suspicion of Maria Cristina, his doubts about Isabella's paternity, his rage at mockery, both real and imagined. Spain watched and waited, knowing the end was near. A kingdom once bound by his paranoia now prayed for the silence that death would bring. The end came quietly in 1833, almost anticlimactic after a lifetime of grotesque drama. Ferdinand, once hailed as El Deseado, spent his final weeks drifting between delirium and stupor. His body, swollen with gout and ravaged by digestive failure, no longer obeyed him. He muttered orders that made no sense, accused ministers of treason, and sometimes called out to the dead, Maria Antonia, Isabel, Maria Josefa, as though they stood by his bed. On better days he stared for hours at the infant Isabella, torn between love and resentment, between hope and the cruel irony of her birth. On the 29th of September, 1833, the king finally died. The official cause was listed as complications of gout, but his physicians knew better. He had been consumed not by one disease but by the accumulation of decades of obsession, paranoia, and shame. The man who had terrorized Spain had simply wasted away, undone by his own body and mind. Death, however, did not bring dignity. The physicians performed a secret autopsy, their notes hidden away in archives too sensitive for public eyes. What they found confirmed everything whispered for decades. Ferdinand's member, preserved for study, measured an astounding 14 inches in length, tapering unnaturally thin at the base, before swelling grotesquely at the tip. Scar tissue and deformities suggested repeated self-mutilation, desperate attempts at correction with blades and instruments that had only worsened his condition. Some tissues showed signs of infection and damage, so severe that normal intimacy would have been impossible. The organ, sealed in jars and sketches, was eventually hidden in Vatican archives, deemed too scandalous to release. It remains one of history's strangest state secrets, a medical curiosity locked away like a relic of shame. Scholars who later glimpsed the records described them with unease, fascinating but repulsive, a window into a reign defined by private torment and public disaster. As his body was prepared for burial, Madrid reacted with uneasy relief. Some mourned, for a king was still a king. Bells tolled, masses were said, processions carried his coffin through solemn streets. But behind closed doors many sighed with relief. The tyrant was gone. The paranoid eyes that had watched and accused were closed forever. Spain at last could breathe, and yet his death did not end the nightmare. He left behind a child, Queen Isabella II, barely 3 years old. Her legitimacy doubted, her throne contested. Within months Spain would plunge into civil war, the Carlist Wars fought over whether Isabella had the right to inherit. Ferdinand's obsession with heirs, the deformity that had defined his life, had only passed the curse to the next generation. His reign stands as one of the most grotesque cautionary tales in history. A man whose private shame infected his public rule. A king whose paranoia destroyed trust, whose cruelty broke lives, whose obsession left Spain weaker than he had found it. His anatomy was not just a deformity of flesh, but a metaphor for a monarchy deformed by centuries of inbreeding secrecy and corruption. When the royal physicians sealed Ferdinand's grotesque organ in its jar, he must have understood the symbolism. He was not just preserving tissue. He was preserving the most intimate monument of a reign that had consumed wives, subjects, and empire alike. The desired one had died, as he had lived, grotesque, paranoid, destructive. And Spain, emerging from the shadow of his reign, would spend generations struggling to heal the wounds left by the most perverse monarch in its history.